It is one thing to know that you disagree with someone. It's a different thing to know exactly why you disagree with them. Where does your disagreement lie? So what makes it that you believe something to be false that this other person believes to be true? And to pinpoint that requires some investigation. So what I would like to do is investigate closely Roger Scruton's argument for the claim that photography is not a representational art. We've already agreed that, as a claim, that surely is controversial. We know of so many photographic artists, and so it seems ludicrous to suggest that what they're doing would not be art. But it is actually quite interesting to unpack Scruton's reasoning for that claim. And in order to do that, what we need to be looking for is the specific premises that lead to the conclusion that photography is not a representational art. So in doing that, I would recommend reading the article, which again I will place in a link below. You will see that Scruton has a lot to say about various things. He talks about painting, he talks about photography, he has a discussion about meaning, he has a discussion about intention. Where do you need to look in order to fight these premises for the argument? It's clear that a very important part or aspect of his argument has to do with the automatic nature of photography. So when he emphasizes that photography is a merely causal process, that it is just automatic or mechanical, he seems to be excavating or highlighting something important about what we could call the nature or essence of the photographic medium. He seems to think that there is something about the photographic medium as such that renders it somehow invalid for being a representational art. And notice that he also talks about this ideal photograph. So he's not so much concerned with the actual photographers that we find in the world. He is looking at the essential features of photography as a process. And he wants to say that those features render it somehow impossible that this could constitute a representational form of art. Now again, this yet isn't a neat and clear argument. There's sort of a heap of considerations here. So in order to look at the argument that Scruton develops for his claim, we need to think about the central concepts involved in his conclusion. So his conclusion is, photography is not a representational art. What are the central concepts in this conclusion? Photography, on the one hand, and representational art on the other. So when reading his article, what you need to ask yourself, what does he say about photography and what does he say about representational art? Because those two discussions might very well add up to some interesting insight about why photography can't be a representational art. So what does he assume about representational art? Well, there's one very important thing Scruton emphasizes, wants us to accept, and that is that a representational art allows for a kind of interest, aesthetic interest, in the process or properties of representation itself. And think about this. So if you want to say that there is an art of pottery, the idea is that this is only so because pottery, as a practice or a process, can be appreciated aesthetically. So you might think that a pot that is made by some artist is beautiful because it is your favorite color, it's a blue pot. Well, that really wouldn't be enough to make the object you're appreciating a work of art, because you're just appreciating it because of its color. It's just your favorite color. When you appreciate it as a work of art, which you very well can do with pottery, you appreciate the way the pot has been formed, shaped, the decisions that underpin the process of making it. And that is just the process of pottery, of making a pot out of ceramics or clay. This is something that we can aesthetically appreciate over and above all the other features that we might like. For instance, its color or the fact that it was made by one of our best friends. So we see that there's something interesting about representational art. Representational art is a form of art, if it is one, because there are aesthetic aspects, there is aesthetic appreciation that is possible of the process of representing. Now, what assumption does he make about photography? We've already seen that he thinks of photography as a causal or an automatic process. But in a way, for the argument, that is a little bit too specific. Because we need to say something about photography or assume something about photography that allows it, somehow conceptually, to connect to the assumption we've just made about representational art. So you will see that the only way that can really be done straightforwardly is to assume something about photography that again is a claim about aesthetic interest. Because that was the concept that we associated with representational art. Now we need to associate it in a slightly different way with photography, such that these two assumptions lead us to the conclusion that we want in the argument. So let's look at how Scruton talks about photography in light of aesthetic interest. And he does say something about this. So if you look at the article, you will see that he will say that photography, as such, doesn't allow for aesthetic interest in representation itself. So what he ascribed to representational art, he sort of denies of photography. He says that the photograph is transparent. And by this he doesn't mean optical transparency in the way that a window is transparent. He doesn't think that when you look at a photograph you can literally see through it to the object that was photographed. He means transparent in a very specific sense. It is transparent to our interests or aesthetic interests. So he wants to say that when we take an aesthetic interest in a photograph, then the interest goes out to the object that was photographed. There is no interest that we can take in the representation itself, at least not if we're approaching it as a photograph. So now we know enough to reconstruct the argument of Scruton's article in its most basic, simple form. And that's a good exercise. If you manage to reconstruct someone's argument in a very simple form, a form that you know to be a valid argument, so an argument that works logically, then you can see very clearly where you disagree with that person, if you disagree with them. Because then you will be able to identify which of the premises or steps in the argument you don't want to make, want to resist. So let's put Scruton's assumptions in this valid argument form. Now the argument form involved is a modus tollens argument. And that argument form is ubiquitous. You can use it to talk about any kind of thing. So take the following modus tollens argument. If I can see, then I have eyes. That's the first premise. I do not have eyes. That's the second premise. And so the conclusion is, I cannot see. Here you see that the argument starts with making something like a conditional statement. This is what we call an if-then statement. So it says if something is the case, then something else is the case. If I can see, well then I have eyes. Another way of putting it is to say that from the assumption that I can see, we're allowed to infer or conclude that I have eyes. It somehow follows from my being able to see that I have eyes. That is the assumption we make in the first premise. And then the second premise, we assume that I do not have eyes. We might do this on the basis of empirical grounds. If you see that I in fact do not have eyes, or you might just assume it for the sake of argument, just to show how such an argument works. And then it is a valid conclusion if we make these two assumptions that I can't see. Because if I could see, I would have eyes. I don't have eyes, so I can't see. Even more abstractly, formulate this in terms of propositional letters. So replace the sentences in these statements, embedded in these statements, with letters, and you will see the form of the argument. So the argument takes the following form: if P, then Q, where P and Q stand for these specific sentences, I can see and I have eyes. The second premise is a denial of Q, so it's not Q. It is not true that I have eyes. And the conclusion is a denial of P. It is not true that I can see, not P. So any argument that takes that form, if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P, is logically valid. It's a good argument. So if you want to disagree with someone's conclusion that is based on such an argument, you need to disagree with at least one of the premises. You need to say, at least of premise 1 or of premise 2, that that premise is mistaken, that it is false. In the example argument, it is clear that I do have eyes. So the second premise is false. The first premise we can accept. If I can see, then I have eyes. That is true. So when you disagree with the conclusion that I cannot see, then it is sufficient to point out that I do have eyes. So the argument for the conclusion is not sound. The conclusion doesn't follow because one of the premises is not true. Now we can fit Scruton's argument exactly in this modus tollens scheme. And the argument then becomes as follows. If photography is a representational art, then photography allows for an aesthetic interest in representation itself. First premise. Second premise, photography doesn't allow for an aesthetic interest in representation itself. That's the second premise. And now the conclusion, therefore, photography is not a representational art. Here all I've done is just replace these P's and Q's with the specific assumptions that Scruton has been making about representational art and photography. And you see that the resulting argument is a valid argument for the conclusion that photography is not a representational art. So if we now say we disagree with that conclusion, we can now ask ourselves, which of these two premises do we disagree with? And that is something you should make up your own mind on. So you should now consider, do you think it plausible, do you want to accept that if something is a representational art, then it allows for aesthetic interest in representation itself? On the other hand, you should ask yourself, do I agree with the assumption that photography does not allow for aesthetic interest in representation itself?